When a poor father gives an expensive dog to his 6-year-old daughter, he is surprisingly arrested. The reason for his arrest leaves the community in shock. But what happens next moves even the officers who arrested him when they understood the father's desperate situation. Before we dive in, if you, like us, are a total animal lover, subscribe to the channel now so you don't miss any heartwarming stories. Thanks. Now back to our story. The morning sun streamed lazily through the floral curtains of Michael's bedroom, casting dancing shadows on the pastel blue walls. John watched his daughter sleep, a gentle smile playing on his lips as he considered how this little 6-year-old had transformed his life. The clock read 6:45 a.m., and soon he'd need to wake her up for school. But for now, he allowed himself this moment of quiet contemplation. Michael stirred slightly. Her blonde curls spread across the pillow like a halo. Even after 3 years, John still marveled at the miracle she represented in his life. When Susan, his wife, passed away in the accident, he thought he'd never smile again. The world had become a grey and pointless place until fate placed Michael in his path. He vividly remembered the day he met her at the foster home. She was only 3 years old and was sitting alone in a corner of the yard, clutching a tattered teddy bear. Her eyes, big and expressive like Susan's, instantly captured his soul. In that moment, he knew they were meant for each other. John sat on the edge of the bed, gently stroking his daughter's hair. "Almost, Princess. How about a special breakfast today? Pancakes with chocolate syrup." "They're a little itchy," she replied, scratching her face absent-mindedly, "but they don't hurt." Michael agreed without much interest, already more concerned with choosing which dress she'd wear that day. John helped her with her morning routine, but he couldn't take his eyes off those spots. As he made the pancakes, his mind wandered to dark places he refused to acknowledge. Breakfast went by with the usual cheerfulness. Michael talked animatedly about the science project she was presenting at school, her little hands gesturing energetically as she explained how she had built a baking soda volcano with Grandma over the weekend. The fear, which had previously been just a distant shadow, now materialized as an icy weight in his stomach. John grabbed the phone and called work, telling them he wouldn't be in today. Then he called Michael's school. The volcano presentation would have to wait. In the car, on the way to the hospital, he watched his daughter in the rearview mirror. She had fallen asleep almost immediately, something totally out of character for her. The spots on her face seemed to have spread, now also visible on her neck. As he drove, John gripped the steering wheel so tightly that his knuckles turned white. A voice in his mind screamed that something was terribly wrong, but he refused to listen. Michael was all he had in the world, his light, his reason to live. Nothing bad could happen to her. The hospital loomed ahead, imposing and intimidating. John parked the car and picked Michael up in his arms, his heart breaking as he realized how much lighter she felt than usual. As he walked towards the emergency room, a nurse noticed his distraught expression and rushed to help. The hours that followed at the hospital seemed to drag on endlessly. John watched helplessly as Michael underwent an endless battery of tests. Every time a nurse came into the room with more forms or requisitions, his heart leaped, hoping for news that didn't come. Michael remained extraordinarily brave throughout the process. Even when the needles pierced her delicate skin for another blood draw, she just squeezed her father's hand tighter, her eyes fixed on the cartoons playing on the small TV in the room. John swallowed the lump forming in his throat. "Soon, Princess. The doctors just need to make sure you're okay." He stroked her hair, noting with growing concern that more spots had appeared, now also on her arms. Grandma Betty, his mom, arrived in the mid-afternoon, bringing Michael's favorite teddy bear and a change of clothes for John. Her eyes met her son's, filled with silent worry. She had lost her daughter, Susan, so suddenly. The idea that something could happen to her granddaughter was unbearable. He shook his head negatively. "I can't leave her, Mom. What if the doctors come with the results?" Reluctantly, John agreed. On the way to the cafeteria, his phone rang. It was his supervisor at the construction company, questioning his absence. John explained the situation quickly, promising to send the necessary documentation as soon as possible. The voice on the other end of the line sounded cold and distant as he reminded him of the week's important deadlines. When he returned to the room, he found Dr. Miller waiting for him. Her face was grave, and John felt his world begin to crumble even before she started talking. John heard the doctor's words as if he were underwater. Terms like aggressive melanoma, metastasis, and experimental treatment floated around him, but his brain refused to process them completely. Dr. Miller hesitated for a moment. Without immediate treatment, a week, maybe less. With treatment, she paused, carefully choosing her words. We can try to extend that time, but I need to be honest. The prognosis isn't favorable. John's world crumbled in that instant. Through the half-open door of the room, he could see Michael sleeping peacefully, oblivious to the storm that was approaching. How could it be possible? His little princess, who just yesterday was running through the park, was now fighting an invisible and relentless enemy. We need to start treatment immediately, Dr. Miller replied. I'm going to refer you to a specialist, but I must warn you, the treatment is extremely expensive, and not all procedures are covered by your health insurance. Michael chose that moment to wake up, her sleepy eyes searching for her dad. Dad, are you crying? The days that followed turned into a race against time. John threw himself headfirst into Michael's treatment, dedicating every second of his day to the fight for his daughter's life. The savings he had put aside for her college began to disappear quickly, swallowed up by specialized consultations, experimental medications, and therapy sessions. At the construction company, his supervisor showed less and less patience with his frequent absences and late reports. John, I understand your situation, he said during a particularly tense meeting, but we have deadlines to meet. The company can't stop because of your personal problems. Personal problems? The words echoed in his mind as he drove to the hospital for another treatment session, as if his daughter's life could be reduced to a personal problem. In the back seat, Michael played distractedly with her teddy bear, humming a school song. Despite the increasing fatigue and the spots that now covered much of her body, she maintained that innocent smile that melted his heart. John adjusted the rearview mirror to look at her. Grandma's just worried, princess. You know how emotional she gets. At the hospital, while Michael was having another treatment session, John took the opportunity to review his finances on his laptop. The numbers in red on the screen seemed to mock him. His savings were practically depleted, and debts were beginning to pile up. The health insurance company refused to cover some of the most promising treatments, classifying them as experimental. His phone vibrated. It was another message from his supervisor. The third warning in 2 weeks. John knew he was on thin ice at work, but how could he focus on projects and spreadsheets when his daughter was fighting for her life? In the room, he found his daughter sitting on the bed, her eyes shining with excitement despite the obvious exhaustion. Dad, Dad, you won't believe what I saw on TV. That's it, a samoyed. Michael clapped her hands. Dad, it's so beautiful. It looks like a baby polar bear. Can we get one? Please, please. Michael, honey, he began, but was interrupted by a new coughing fit from the girl. John sat on the edge of the bed, holding his daughter's frail little hands in his. How about we watch more videos about samoyeds? We can research everything about them. When Michael finally fell asleep, exhausted after the treatment session, John went out into the hallway and allowed the tears to finally fall. It was then that he noticed a flyer lying on the floor, an advertisement for a samoyed breeder in the next town. His hands trembled as he picked up the paper, a terrible idea beginning to form in his mind. The rain drummed softly against the hospital room window as John reread the samoyed breeder's flyer for the 100th time. The price of the puppy was equivalent to 3 months of his salary. Money he no longer had. Beside him, Michael slept restlessly, her small hands occasionally twitching on the blanket. He shook his head negatively, his eyes fixed on Michael's pale face. "I can't, Mom. Every minute is precious now." Grandma Betty nodded, her eyes welling up with the memory of her daughter. "Your wife was an extraordinary woman, John. She faced everything with such strength." "It's not the same, Mom." He stood up, walking to the window. The night city stretched out before him, thousands of lights shining in the darkness. You didn't see how her eyes lit up when she saw the dog. It was the first time in weeks she showed real joy. John didn't answer immediately. His eyes wandered around the room, stopping on the drawings that Michael had made, all of them now depicting fluffy white dogs. "I got my layoff notice today," he said at last. "The supervisor said there was no way to justify my absences anymore." What would it change? He laughed humorlessly. The bills would keep coming, the treatment would still be needed. And now, his voice faltered, "Now my daughter has a last wish and I can't fulfill it." "No, Mom," John interrupted her gently. "You've already done more than enough. You sold your car, took out a second mortgage. You can't sacrifice yourself anymore." John felt his heart break once more. He approached the bed, tucking the blanket around his daughter. It was then that he noticed something that made him freeze. A new set of spots, darker than the previous ones, had appeared on her neck. In the hospital hallway, John leaned against the wall, letting his body slide to the floor. The Samoyed breeder's flyer weighed heavily in his pocket like lead. In his mind, images mixed. Michael running in the park, laughing, Susan in the hospital, saying that hope was everything, his daughter drawing white dogs with smiles on their faces. Slowly, he took his cell phone out of his pocket and began to search. Breeder's address, location routines, security systems. His hands trembled, but his determination grew with each minute. The voice of reason in his mind screamed that it was crazy, that there were limits that shouldn't be crossed. The week that followed turned John into a different man. During the day, he stayed by Michael's side at the hospital, smiling and telling stories, but his nights were dedicated to a dark purpose. After his daughter fell asleep, he drove to the neighborhood where the Samoyed kennel was located, studying every detail of the place. The establishment was in a quiet residential area, a large house with a spacious backyard where the puppies played during the day. John watched from afar, hidden in his car, mentally noting the employees' schedules, the times when the lights went out, the positioning of the security cameras. "Look, Aunt Carol." Michael held up the drawing proudly. "I made him smiling just like on the show." "Not yet," Michael replied thoughtfully. "Dad, what are we going to call our puppy when he comes?" That night, after Michael fell asleep, John found Dr. Miller in the hallway. Her face was grave. Staggering into the hospital bathroom, John threw up all the coffee he had drunk. His hands trembled as he washed his face, and when he looked in the mirror, he barely recognized the man he saw reflected. Deep circles marked his face, and his eyes carried a despair that he never imagined being possible to feel. He returned to Michael's room, watching his daughter sleep. Next to the bed, dozens of drawings of Samoyeds covered the wall, her own makeshift art gallery. In each of them, the dog smiled, and in some, there was a small family drawn alongside, her dad, and the fluffy white dog. His phone vibrated in his pocket. It was a notification from the weather app. Heavy rain forecast for the following night. John looked out the window, then at his daughter, and finally at the drawings on the wall. His decision was made. Instead, he drove to a 24-hour hardware store. He bought gloves, a small flashlight, and other tools that might be useful. Each item was paid for in cash. Then he parked his car a few blocks from the breeder's place and waited for the rain to start. The plan was etched in his mind with the precision of someone who had spent years managing construction projects. He knew exactly where the cameras were positioned. He knew the blind spots. He had memorized the night watchman's routine. He had even studied the behavior of the kennel's adult dogs, learning their feeding and rest schedules. While waiting for the right moment, John took out his cell phone and looked at the photo of Michael he used as wallpaper. She was smiling, healthy and happy on her first day of school. Next to it, stored in the phone case, was her latest medical report. The rain started to fall, first in soft drops, then with increasing force. John took a deep breath, put on his gloves, and checked his equipment one more time. In his chest, a silent battle raged between the man who had always prided himself on his honesty and the father who would do anything to see his daughter smile one last time. The rain fell in dense sheets, turning the streetlights into golden blurs. John waited until the watchman made his last rounds before getting out of the car. Dressed entirely in black, he moved like a shadow among the trees of the residential neighborhood, his heart beating so hard it felt like it would explode. The kennel was partially lit, but the storm created the perfect conditions for what he needed to do. John knew every inch of the property after days of observation. He knew that the puppies stayed in a room attached to the main house, with access to a small covered area for exercise. He skirted the perimeter of the property, staying in the shadows. The adult dogs were inside because of the heavy rain, exactly as he had predicted. Reaching the back of the house, he identified the window that gave access to the puppy room. It was small, but sufficient for a thin man like him, especially after weeks of barely eating at the hospital. With trembling hands, he began to work on the window lock. Years supervising construction sites had given him enough knowledge about different types of locks and how to manipulate them. Still, each second felt like an eternity, and the sound of the rain, which was supposed to mask his movements, sounded deafening in his ears. Finally, the window gave way with a soft click. John paused, making sure no one had noticed. Sweat dripped down his face, mixing with the rain. In his mind, the image of Michael drawing her white dogs gave him the courage to continue. The room was warm and smelled like puppies. Through the dim light, he distinguished several low pens where the little Samoyed slept. Moving with extreme caution, he approached the nearest pen. 5 snow-white puppies were nestled together, small balls of fur that rose and fell with their peaceful breathing. One of them, slightly smaller than the others, raised its head upon sensing his presence. Instead of barking, the puppy simply stared at him with curious bright eyes. John felt tears forming. They were the same sweet, trusting eyes as Michael's. He froze in place, barely daring to breathe. The voices got louder. Someone was coming to check on the puppies. In a panic, he looked at the open window, then at the puppy in his arms. There was no time to retreat. The door opened and a bright light flooded the room. "I thought I heard something," said a male voice. "This rain is making the whole house creak." "There's water coming in from somewhere," commented the man, noticing the dampness on the floor. "I need to check these windows tomorrow." With calculated movements, he headed to the window. The rain had subsided a bit, but it was still falling hard enough to hinder visibility. It was now or never. When he finally reached the vehicle, his legs barely supported him. He gently placed the puppy on the passenger seat, where he had prepared a cushioned box with blankets. The little animal looked at him with those sweet eyes, letting out a soft yawn. At the hospital, Michael slept, dreaming of white dogs that smiled and played in the snow. She didn't know that, on that rainy night, her father had crossed a line from which there was no return, all to fulfill her last wish. The sun had barely risen when John arrived at the hospital, carrying a box covered by a colorful blanket. His heart raced, torn between the anxiety of seeing Michael's reaction and the constant fear of being discovered. The puppy had been surprisingly cooperative during the night, sleeping peacefully in his bathroom among pillows and blankets. "A surprise for Michael," he replied, trying to keep his voice casual. "Is she awake?" "Dad," her voice was weak, "you're late today." The cry of joy that Michael let out upon seeing the puppy made all of John's worries momentarily disappear. Her eyes, dulled by the disease, shone with an intensity he hadn't seen in weeks. John picked up the puppy and gently placed it on the bed. The little animal immediately snuggled up to Michael, licking her face with instant adoration. The girl laughed, a crystalline sound that filled the room with a long-forgotten joy. In the hallway, the doctor crossed her arms. "I understand your intention, but bringing an animal into the hospital, there are protocols, regulations." Her words were interrupted by a commotion at the end of the hallway. Two uniformed police officers were talking to the receptionist, who pointed towards Michael's room. "We received a report about the theft of a Samoyed puppy last night. Security cameras in the neighborhood recorded your car near the location." The police officers exchanged glances, and the older one sighed heavily. "Sir, we need you to come with us to the police station." John closed his eyes, feeling the weight of the handcuffs on his wrists. In the room, he could hear his daughter starting to cry, calling for him in an increasingly desperate voice. The Samoyed puppy barked, as if trying to protest against the impending separation. The cell was cold and impersonal, but John barely noticed the physical discomfort. His world had been reduced to the torturous memories of Michael's cries and the painful awareness that every minute inside was a precious minute lost alongside his daughter. "How is she?" was John's first question, his voice hoarse with despair. "Nurse Carol is taking care of him for now. Michael only calms down a little when he's around." Grandma Betty paused. "Son, the lawyer I got said that, given the circumstances, we can try for a temporary release. But," John closed his eyes, remembering the night of the theft, "I just wanted to see her smile one last time, Mom. I just wanted to give her that last moment of happiness." Grandma Betty took a folded paper out of her purse, covered with Michael's characteristic drawings. More white dogs, of course. "Dear Dad," she began to read, her voice trembling, "please come back soon. Snow and I are waiting for you. I promise I'll be strong and take all my medicine properly. Snow is the best present I've ever gotten. He takes care of me when you're not here, but it's not the same. I love you so much. From your Michael." The simple words of his daughter hit John like physical blows. "Snow?" he asked, trying to control the tremor in his voice. His voice was interrupted by a sob. How could he promise something like that? The owner of the kennel was determined to prosecute him, and even if he got temporary release, how long would that take? Time was exactly what Michael didn't have. During the early morning, while the other inmates slept, John remained awake, praying, something he hadn't done since Susan's death. He pleaded not for his own freedom, but for more time. Time to be with Michael, to hold her hand, to see her play with Snow. "Mr. Mendez," he said in a low voice, "I have news about your case, and I need to be honest, and it's not good." "Daddy," his 6-year-old daughter Laura ran to hug him as soon as he entered the house. Her blonde hair was tied in 2 braids, and her blue eyes shone with joy. "Come see, I'm on TV." The suspect, John Mendez, a former construction worker, confessed to stealing the puppy for his 6-year-old daughter Michael, who is terminally ill at St. Clair's Hospital. According to medical sources, the girl has only a few days to live. Richard sat down heavily on the sofa, his daughter's words echoing in his mind. For the first time since the incident, he allowed himself to see the situation from another angle. The sick girl was the same age as Laura. On TV, the report showed a photo of Michael with the stolen puppy. The girl, clearly weakened, smiled radiantly as she hugged the little Samoyed. Her cheeks were stained by the disease, but her eyes shone with a pure joy that broke Richard's heart. Luna, the family's golden retriever, approached upon hearing her name. Laying her head on Richard's knee, he absently stroked her ears, remembering the day he brought her home. Laura's huge smile, the joy that the animal had brought to their lives after the death of his wife. After Laura left, Richard remained in the room, lost in thought. As a breeder, he had every right to prosecute John Mendez. The man had broken into his property, stolen one of his valuable puppies. It was the right thing to do, wasn't it? But then he thought of Michael in her last days of life. He thought of Laura, how devastated she would be if she were dying and he wasn't by her side. The stolen puppy was the runt of his last litter, the one he had had the most difficulty selling because it was slightly smaller than the others. "Mr. Davidson, yes, about the puppy case." He paused, looking at the photo of Laura on the wall. "There's been a change of plans." The detective looked at him surprised. "Are you sure? You seem pretty determined to prosecute him." As he signed the necessary papers, Richard thought of Laura, of her tight hugs, of her crystalline laughter. He thought of Michael, bravely fighting a terrible disease, finding a last breath of joy in a little Samoyed puppy. John couldn't sleep. The lawyer's words about the not very good news hammered in his head. 4 days. 4 days had already passed since Dr. Miller had given the 1-week deadline. Time was slipping through his fingers like fine sand. John blinked several times, sure that he had fallen asleep and was dreaming. "What do you mean?" Outside the police station, 2 surprises awaited him. The first was his mother, who hugged him crying. The second was a tall man in a well-cut suit, who introduced himself as Richard Almeida. For not understanding before, for having allowed principles and pride to override what really matters. Richard took an envelope from his pocket. "This is for your daughter. It's the ownership certificate of the puppy, officially transferred to her name." The drive to the hospital seemed endless. Grandma Betty drove as fast as she could, while John squirmed with anxiety in the passenger seat. In his lap, the envelope with Snow's certificate weighed like a second chance. When they finally arrived at the hospital, John barely waited for the car to stop completely before jumping out. He ran through the hallways, his heart beating so hard it felt like it would explode. "She had a rough night," Carol whispered upon seeing him, "but she refused to sleep until recently, saying she needed to wait for her dad to come back." "Dad?" Her voice was just a whisper. "Is it really you?" The puppy, upon hearing his name, lifted his head and barked softly, wagging his tail. John reached out to stroke him, realizing how perfectly adapted the animal seemed to his role as guardian. The early morning dragged on at the hospital, marked only by the rhythmic beep of the monitors and Michael's shallow breathing. John didn't take his eyes off his daughter, memorizing every detail of her face, as if trying to keep her image for eternity. Snow remained faithfully by her side on the bed, occasionally lifting his head to check on his little owner. Dr. Miller entered the room silently, carrying a stack of tests. Her face was marked by the fatigue of long hours on duty, but there was something different in her expression. Actually, she hesitated, as if carefully choosing her words. "We're observing a small but significant reduction in the spots, and her blood levels have shown a slight improvement." "I know what I said," she interrupted him gently. "And scientifically it doesn't make sense, but sometimes we see cases like this in medicine, especially in children. We call it spontaneous remission. It's rare, extremely rare, but it happens." Back in the room, John watched his daughter sleeping. The spots on her face, which previously seemed to spread like wildfire, actually seemed less intense. Or was it just his desperate desire to see improvement? "Because you're the strongest and bravest girl I've ever known." He leaned down to kiss her forehead. "Stronger even than Mom. Did you know that he's officially yours now?" John showed the certificate again. "The kennel owner, Mr. Richard, made sure to give you this gift." "Sometimes," she whispered, "when I'm very scared or in a lot of pain, Mom appears in my dreams. She's always smiling and says that everything will be okay." As Michael fell asleep again, John noticed something different in her breathing. It was stronger, more regular. Snow settled down beside her like a living plush guardian, and John could have sworn that the puppy looked at him with a wisdom far beyond his age. The following days were an emotional roller coaster. On one hand, Michael's tests continued to show small improvements. Her spots gradually diminished and her blood values stabilized. On the other hand, she still faced severe crises that left everyone on the brink of despair. On a particularly difficult afternoon, while Michael was sleeping after a strong crisis, John met Richard in the hospital hallway. The breeder had begun making regular visits, always bringing some small gift for Michael. Once a book about dogs, another time a Samoyed stuffed animal. Richard smiled, looking through the door of the room where Snow stood guard next to Michael's bed. You know, that puppy was always special. He was the runt of the litter, but he had something different in his eyes. Now I know why. He was destined for a bigger mission. "Michael!" John ran to the bed, but was quickly pushed aside by the medical team that stormed into the room. The minutes dragged on like hours. In the hallway, John held Snow in his arms, both trembling. Richard remained at his side, a firm hand on his shoulder, offering silent support. "Mr. John, we need to talk. Michael is stable, but—" She paused, choosing her words. "What happened today was a reaction to the treatment. It's something we feared could happen. It's an aggressive procedure. In Michael's current state—" Dr. Miller hesitated. "There's a significant risk, but honestly, without it—" John looked at the man who days ago wanted to see him in jail and now offered help without hesitation. The tears he had held back until then finally fell. As if he had heard his name, the puppy gently broke free from John's arms and jumped onto the bed with surprising agility. With infinite care, he lay down next to Michael, his small body serving as a source of warmth and comfort. "A little, Princess, but I'll be here the whole time, and so will Snow." The weeks that followed were the most intense in John's life. The experimental treatment was exactly as Dr. Miller had warned, aggressive and exhausting. Michael faced the side effects with a bravery that moved everyone at the hospital, but there were times when even her strength didn't seem enough. During the long nights of fever and pain, Snow had become a constant and vital presence. The puppy seemed to have a sixth sense for Michael's crises. Minutes before any change in her vital signs, he would start barking, alerting the medical team. John watched his daughter sleeping, the puppy nestled protectively by her side. The spots on her skin, once so frightening, were beginning to show clear signs of regression. Dr. Miller spoke of promising response to treatment, but John suspected that there was something more happening there, something that science might not be able to explain completely. One morning, after another difficult night, Michael woke up different. Her cheeks had a color that they hadn't had in a long time, and her eyes shone with more life. She was smiling a lot. "She said she's proud of me, of Snow, and of you." Michael paused, stroking the puppy, who immediately raised his head upon hearing his name. "She said that now she can rest easy, because we're not alone anymore." Richard, the man who once wanted to prosecute him, was now a constant presence at the hospital, bringing not only financial support, but also sincere friendship. His daughter Laura had become friends with Michael, visiting her whenever possible and filling the hospital room with childish laughter. And Grandma Betty, his tireless mother, was the anchor that kept everything running, taking care of the practical details of life while John dedicated himself entirely to his daughter's recovery. The girl smiled, proudly showing her latest works of art. They were no longer just Samoyeds. Now there were drawings of the entire hospital family, as she called them. Dr. Miller with her stethoscope, Carol with her medication cart, Richard and Laura playing with Snow, her grandma with her homemade cookies. John held his breath, his heart racing. Michael looked curiously at the doctor, still absently stroking Snow's fur. Dr. Miller smiled, her eyes watering. "That means, Michael, that you're winning this battle. We still have a road ahead of us, but now we can say with certainty, you're going to be okay." 6 months had passed since that afternoon, when Dr. Miller brought the news that would change their lives. It was a Sunday morning, and the city park was full of families enjoying the pleasant weather. John watched, sitting on a bench, while Michael ran through the grass with Snow, her hair once again long and shining, dancing in the wind. The Samoyed, now bigger but still with the same sweet look, sat obediently, while Michael showed a new trick they had practiced. John applauded, his heart overflowing with joy at seeing his daughter so healthy and happy. The spots on her skin had practically disappeared, leaving only a few soft marks that, according to Dr. Miller, would likely fade with time. More important than the physical marks was the light in her eyes, the constant smile, the inexhaustible energy that had returned with full force. "Michael!" Laura ran to hug her friend. "I brought that new dog story book I promised you." After Michael was discharged from the hospital, Richard had helped him get a new job at his law firm, not as a lawyer, of course, but in the administrative sector, where his management experience was valued. The salary was better than at the construction company, and the environment more understanding of his family needs. "Thinking about how blessed we are, Mom." John took a sip of the drink. "You know, sometimes I still wake up in the middle of the night and go to her room just to make sure it wasn't all a dream." It was true. The puppy they had received in such dramatic circumstances had grown to become an extraordinary dog. Even now that Michael was healed, he maintained his protective nature, always attentive to any sign of discomfort or sadness from his owner. "I said that her mom never stopped being present, that she was the one who sent snow to help us when we needed it most." John smiled, grabbing the backpack where Michael kept her inseparable sketchbook. The family portrayed on the paper now included many more people than before. Besides him, Michael, and Snow, there were Grandma Betty, Richard and Laura, Dr. Miller, Nurse Carol, and even an ethereal figure in the corner of the page that Michael insisted was her mom, Susan, watching over everyone from above. "It's beautiful, Michael." Richard praised the drawing. "You're getting better every day. Who knows, maybe one day you'll become a famous artist." Everyone laughed, and John felt his eyes fill with tears of gratitude. There, in that perfect moment in the park, with his daughter healthy and happy, surrounded by people who loved them, he understood that sometimes the greatest miracles come disguised in the most unexpected forms. About everything being okay in the end. And there, under the sun of that Sunday morning, surrounded by his extended family and watching his daughter play with the dog that had changed their lives, John knew that no matter what happened, they would never be alone again.